Today we're going to look at Jim's buttons. At the last meeting, at the last home meeting before the lockdown came about, we were looking at some images on John Iles's computer, and Jim mentioned the buttons in the top right-hand corner and how much he used them. And this pretty much fell on deaf ears. It resulted in a lot of blank stares. So let's take a look at what are Jim's buttons and how do we use them. First of all, they only exist when you're processing a raw image. And the images that John Iles was showing were JPEGs, so the buttons weren't there for Jim to talk about. So let's look at a raw image. Now this one is always going to be a hard one to edit. It's inside the cockpit of one of the fireplanes when it was being serviced at Malaga Airport, and so it's pretty dark inside and very, very bright outside because it was a bright sunny day, summertime being fire season. But it's a raw image, and here we see Jim's buttons. So what do they do? Let's click on the left-hand one, and this one shows any of the highlights that are being blown out, and we can also see it on the histogram. If we look at the histogram over here, we can see it going off to the right. So there is an expression always exposed to the left, because once detail is lost from the highlights, then there's absolutely no way to get it back. It's gone forever. So with Jim's left-hand button pressed, let's just back down the exposure a bit. And again, we can only do this in RAW because all the data is there. So we've just got rid of all the burnt out bits. And that's going to be a big improvement when we come to process it. Now the middle button shows what's being clipped on the shadows. And we don't want to change the exposure, but we can change the black point, and we can see when it, if we make it blacker, all the blue areas now are being clipped, so there's no detail left in those areas. So if we go back to 0, and incidentally, if you do a double click on the little button, that goes back to the default setting. So now we've got nothing clipped in the shadows, although it's way too dark to use. So what do we do next? Let's go to develop, or we'll just look at the third button. And if we just put everything back to the default, we'll turn off the highlights. But here, this is saying tones are being clipped. So to perhaps oversimplify things a little bit, it means that in this area there's no color left at all. So again, if we just turn down the exposure a bit, we find that those disappear as well. So we'll put the highlights on it again. So we've got highlights and tones. In fact, we've got all three pressed at the moment, and there's nothing being highlighted. So we're good to go. We'll develop it. So now this is still not a JPEG. It's Affinity's own particular format, so it's not quite a RAW anymore. So you can see here we've lost the ability to change the exposure, but we've got lots of other tools. And I don't propose to go through totally editing it, because that's another topic maybe for another day. But if we just go to shadows and highlights, and if we make the shadows lighter, you can see what's happening in the cockpit. So we're getting lots of detail, especially in the overhead, but on the main dash as well. So we can fiddle with this until we have something satisfactory. And I guess we can just turn down the highlights a wee bit, but I would actually do this another way if I was editing it, because you see everything goes a bit soft, and I really don't like that. So there is another way of doing that, but that's not for today. Today is all about Jim's buttons. So basically that's it. From henceforth, these buttons will be known as Jim's buttons. And if anybody has any questions, if you'd like to email to me or WhatsApp me, I'll try and answer them. And while we're in lockdown and we have a bit of time to spare, I'll try and do another couple of videos with hot tips, shall we say, for using Affinity. And just a reminder, Affinity's on sale for the unbelievable price of 28 euros. And I paid about 75 euros for my copy, and about the same again for the workbook. But even at that price, it's a bargain. But at 28 euros, you cannot resist it. And that's for life. They give you all the updates for free. There's no more to pay. So if you want to try Jim's buttons, you have to have Affinity and you have to be shooting in RAW. So that's it for this one. Hope there was something useful there, and we'll look forward to the next one.